Welcome to Chautauqua People. My name is John V., and my guest today is Jerry Pomps. Jerry is a native of Cleveland, spent his childhood in Southern California and Los Angeles, took his undergraduate degree from UCLA, his law degree from Berkeley. After legal training, he went on active duty in the United States Air Force Certificate General Corps, and he served at Truex Air Force Base in Wisconsin as a general legal officer for the Air Force. He then went and served as a legislative analyst supporting the state legislature of California, and was based in Sacramento, and taught political science for a while at Northern Arizona University. Subsequently, he realized his great interest was in public administration. He saw the light, came to upstate New York at the Maxwell School, and took a Ph.D. in public administration. Now, with this good background, he was able to get a good assignment, a good contract there, locally at West Virginia University in Morgantown as an associate professor with tenure beginning in 1974, and finished his career there at WVU. Jerry, what were your duties at West Virginia?
West Virginia, I was a professor of public administration in a graduate program, and my duties were basically to teach. Occasionally I would head the department as a fill-in for as a chair position, and basically I was a senior lecturer and writer.
Okay. What courses did you teach?
I taught most everything in the curriculum. I taught human resource management, I taught ethical leadership, and ethics in administrative justice. I taught labor relations and most everything on conflict resolution and environmental management, and the list goes on and on.
Mm-hmm. And with respect to the ethics, how did you focus upon that issue?
Well, ethics was a challenge to some extent, because although I had some background in philosophy and could teach ethics from a philosophical point of view, there weren't any examples around that I could use to use as models for ethical leadership in government as opposed to business. Mm-hmm. The literature was full of business leadership material, but I recognize George Marshall as a outstanding leader, and a very ethical man who was from a short distance away from West Virginia University, and I seized on him. So I used leadership as a basic template, and I also used a lot of case studies and ethical issues, and just kept my students arguing with each other.
Good, good. Now I understand your interest in George Marshall was substantial, and you prepared a book then on ethical leadership and George Marshall.
Right.
And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that book and how you came to select Marshall, and then how you prepared the book. What were your best sources to work with?
Mm-hmm. Well, as I said, there was no detailed descriptive work that had ever been done on public administrators.
Right.
Marshall was a public administrator. He's regarded as a great military hero, and he was that, of course. But he was also a spectacular administrator. He was just a model, and so I focused on that aspect of his career. And so when I began to do the research, I went to the Marshall Library in Lexington, Virginia, and I talked to the head of the Marshall Papers Project there and told him what I had in mind, to create a model text for public administration students and other students of government. And he couldn't have been more accommodating, and he said that was precisely what was needed. No book had been written on that order. Lots of biographies, but
right.
Nothing. So that set me on my course, and 7 years later I was finished.
Right. 7 years to prepare the book.
7 years.
Now, what were George Marshall's key developmental experiences that you think were instrumental in shaping his set of values?
Well, one interesting story that I may have mentioned to you earlier was that Marshall was always interested in military history. As a boy, he focused on military history is what he shared an interest with his father. His father was a very difficult man.
Right.
And George grew up, as many famous men do, as a mama's boy. George and his father, who was also named George, would go to Fort Necessity in southwestern Pennsylvania to visit the battlefield. And he had this very deep interest in that. So that was one of the major developmental forces. His older brother, Stuart, went to VMI. And George, with his growing interest in the military career, asked his parents if he could go there too. And one day he heard his brother discussing with his mother, he wasn't immediately present to them, heard them having a discussion, and the brother asked that his mother that please don't send George to VMI, he'll embarrass the family. And George overheard this, and he said that was a terrific motivating force in his life, and he wanted to grow up and become a military leader and stick it in Stuart's eye.
And I think he did. Huh?
I think he did.
And so he went to VMI. And what were some of those key assignments that he had that really shaped his character?
Well, one of the first assignments was he became a class leader as a cadet at VMI. He was not a scholar, except in history, and that was about it.
Right.
But he became the top cadet in each of the years. So he became an acknowledged leader,
right,
as a student. After that, after he got married, he married a young woman who lived in a house just off campus. And then he went to, he got his commission finally by going to President McKinley's office and asking that he be allowed to take the exam. And he snuck into McKinley's office.
Really?
That's another story. And it says something about the courage of the man. He went and sat down in the outer office, and there was a family that was there waiting to see the president, and they were called to go in, and he went in with them. And then after they had this talk, and they looked over, and they saw this young man sitting there, they didn't know why he was there.
Right.
They left, and McKinley looked up, and he said, yes, well, do you want something? And he told them that he had just graduated from VMI. He wanted to be allowed to take the military officer examination. So that was one of the acts of courage which motivated moved Marshall on.
And this was at a time when it was not automatic getting the commission.
No, graduating from VMI was not like West Point. It was not an entree into the service. So they were building officer corps at that time because of the need for officers in the Philippines. This was just after the Spanish-American War ended. And so Marshall went to the Philippines as a second lieutenant and served there. And then another key assignment was his service in the Philippines. Again, he went and then he had many assignments designing state National Guard maneuvers.
Really?
So he became an expert in creating war games. So those were some of the early experiences he had.
And he was in World War I, was he not?
He was, and he served, he was on the first boat of American soldiers reaching France. He served with the 1st Army Division in France, and he was the operations officer for that division. At that time, he was a captain, and then was quickly promoted up, getting field commands. But he left the service also as a major. After World War I, he left France as a major.
Now, he had a mentor acquired during World War I?
Yes, he did. He served with General Sebring. And then also Fox Connor became a great advocate of Marshall. As a matter of fact, Connor said later he was the most proficient young officer he had ever seen. But also, he developed a very close association with General Pershing.
Right.
And after the war was over, he became Pershing's aide.
Okay. And Pershing would have been chief of staff at the time?
Pershing was not then chief of staff, but when he was, after the war ended, Pershing returned to Washington and was made chief of staff of the Army.
Right.
And Marcia remained with him for several years as a right-hand man.
Right, right. Now, when Marshall moved along, can you sort of trace his climb in the 30s and then into World War II?
Right. Marshall grew tired of Washington rather quickly, and he asked General Pershing if he couldn't help him to get a command position.
Right.
Throughout all his assignments up to that time, Marshall had been a staff man.
Right.
And you can't achieve high command in the Army as a staff man. He
Right.
wanted a command position.
Right.
Pershing sent him to China, and he served there in Tientsin, China, in a command position, and became very proficient in Chinese. By the way, he taught himself French in World War I, and then he taught himself Chinese in China.
Right.
And also insisted that his officers and others on the post learned as much Chinese as possible. So he was there for 3 years, and then when he returned, he went to the War College. He didn't like teaching. Again, he was in Washington, and his wife died unexpectedly, very suddenly.
Right.
And that sent him into a depression. And after that occurred, he called on Pershing again to give him some assistance. And Pershing found a place for him as commandant of the school at Fort Benning, Georgia,
Right.
infantry training. And Marshall went there and suddenly exploded with verve and enthusiasm, and went on to, in effect, revolutionize Army officer training. And he became, at Benning, he basically identified all the people that he was later to recruit as America's Corps of Generals in World War II.
And so that was critical, wasn't it?
Yes.
And then at the late 30s, he had a very quick rise in rank and positions of importance, as I understand.
Well, it took a while, because when he came out of Benning, he had some assignments and other command assignments in other southern bases in South Carolina and Georgia, and his major interest at that point became the CCC,
Right.
the Civilian Conservation Corps. His career, though, took a nosedive after a couple of those assignments, because General MacArthur, Douglas MacArthur, became Chief of Staff, and MacArthur put him into an Army National Guard position in Chicago, which meant that Colonel Marshall, he had reached the colonel stage by then, would probably never be promoted again before he reached retirement age. And again, Fox Connor and Pershing intervened on Marshall's behalf without Marshall's knowledge, and urged MacArthur first, and also the president, to return Marshall to a command position. And then he was. And in 1937, he returned to Vancouver, Washington, and became a command officer again.
And along my military career, I too was an advisor to that unit. It was a division when he was there, it was a brigade when I was there. And most of us did not like the assignment. And we went through this William Manchester book, American Caesar, on MacArthur, and there's a short phrase in there saying that there was a long gray look that came over Marshall's face during this assignment, which his wife saw very infrequently. And you can understand, for a person who thinks he's going to have a career, it was a difficult time. But indeed, as we saw from the last Desert War, those reserve units are really important for our defense, and in our ability to get work done to keep this country secure. means that they have to deliver. And so that advisory job should not be made light of by any means.
No, and Marshall never had a position that he didn't make lemons out of lemon, or lemonade out of the lemons.
Yeah.
And Chicago was a good example because he became an advocate and a champion of Army National Guard units around the country, and also developed a lot of his ideas for the building of a citizen army. He built an army of 8 million men in World War II, and it was overwhelmingly citizens made soldiers. Right.
And they went back to civilian life and did wonderful things as veterans in the 40s and 50s.
And the CCC served as a model for how you take men and give them military training and very quickly convert them into active, effective soldiers.
And they were physically fit and well disciplined.
Yes.
As a result of that experience, were they not?
Right.
They're not. So Marshall identified these leaders and pulled them forward, and he identified them when he was at the infantry school at Fort Benning.
That's right.
Can you tell us some names of those folks we pulled along?
Sure. Yeah, I'm sure you've heard all of them. There was Bradley. There was General Ridgway. There was Omar Bradley. I mentioned him. Excuse me. There was George Patton. There was Hodges. The list goes on and on.
Right.
84 generals Marshall appointed in World War II.
Right.
And most of those were identified during his experience at Benning, either people that came through the school or people that he identified and brought in as instructors.
Right. So he just kept very good track, probably good notes of who was a distinguished student and maintained contact with him. And we owe him an immense debt of gratitude. Can you speak about his work? He was close. He was probably the first among equals in the Joint Chiefs of Staff during World War II. And can you tell us a little bit about his time after the war?
Okay. When World War II started, he was in the midst of reorganizing the Army, and he did that prior to Pearl Harbor, and he had it all in place. He knew that he couldn't get this reorganization through the Congress at that time because there were so many vested interests that protected themselves with the Congress. But as soon as the war started, he had great leverage, and that organization happened within 2 months. Reorganization occurred quickly with Roosevelt's blessing. One of the aspects of that reorganization was to insist on joint planning with the Navy and the Marines and the various branches of the service branches. Admiral King and the Navy were not very comfortable with this. They believed that the services should be separate and distinct. Marshall never believed in that. As a matter of fact, he would have been happy with one combined service.
Right.
So he suggested to Roosevelt and designed for Roosevelt for his executive order a system whereby you would have a set of chiefs that would sit together and do planning and decision making, and that became the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Marshall, he and his subordinate Hap Arnold became the Chief of Staff for Air,
right,
and then Admiral King of the Navy, and that was 2 Army and 1 Navy, and he evened it up by suggesting Bill Leahy, who was Roosevelt's confidant and naval advisor.
Right.
So then you got 2 Navy, 2 Army, and Marshall became basically the leader of the group by deference,
right,
not because he asked for the title. As a matter of fact, he insisted that Leahy be the formal leader of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Right.
Another question you asked? I lost that.
Let's talk about after the war. We see Marshall becoming Secretary of State, and how did that happen?
Okay, he served as Army Chief of Staff until November of 1945. In other words, he became Chief of Staff on September 1st, 1939, the very day that World War II started with the Nazis invading Poland. So he was there for the entire war. When he retired, his first retirement, he retired 3 times. When he first retired in November of 45, he and his wife took a 10-day vacation. They went down and identified a house in North Carolina that they wanted to buy.
Yep.
They came back to Washington or Leesburg, Virginia. They walked into the house. Mrs. Marshall went upstairs to unpack. The telephone rang. Marshall picked it up, and it was Harry Truman. And Truman says, General, I would like you to go to China for me. And he said, yes, sir. And he hung up the phone. And it was a very short conversation. And when Mrs. Marshall found out that her husband was going back into the service, she was never a fan of Harry Truman's after that. But he went and served, and he did remarkably well. He actually brought about quite some accommodations between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong.
Right, right. Okay, and he was also instrumental in post-war reconstruction funding and getting many of these European economies back on their feet. Let's switch gears a little bit, and let's talk a little more about some of your experiences. How did you come to Chautauqua?
I came to Chautauqua in the mid-'70s because my daughter had auditioned with the ballet company, and they invited her to come for a couple of weeks. So we brought her here to Chautauqua and stayed overnight.
Right.
And then picked her up the following week, and we repeated that process again.
Right.
Another year, and that gave us our introduction. Then we started to come regularly in the 1990s, and we've been here probably 20 times. I lost count.
Yeah. And where did you stay during those early years?
In the early years, we stayed primarily at the church houses, at the denominational houses.
Okay.
And we would stay with the Episcopalians and the Lutherans, and particularly the Disciples, and the Baptists and the Methodists. We met them all. So
having covered all of those fronts, you had a typical Chautauqua experience, didn't you?
Yes.
Okay. Now, you currently have a wonderful position there at the Everett Jewish Life Center. And I wonder if you could tell me how that came about and describe its program for those who are not familiar with it.
The Everett Jewish Life Center was the idea of the Everett family,
right,
particularly Edith Everett. And she and her children decided to build a house here and I think the decision was finally capsulized in 2008, and it was built in honor of Edith's husband, Henry, who had died about 2004, I believe. And they put in a lot of money, and they encouraged others to contribute, and so it was a project of the entire Jewish community. Right. At Chautauqua, with the Everetts making the most contribution. So the idea was to create a community center as well as a bed and breakfast to combine the two ideas in the same institution. And it became basically a gathering place for the Jewish people of Chautauqua. But the idea was always to have it open to the community and the Chautauqua spirit. Right. So it's become an integral part of the Chautauqua community and serves, I think its greatest achievement, my own opinion, is that it was a psychological triumph for the Jewish people of Chautauqua, the idea that they had a home now, and that they had finally arrived, and they were an integral part of the community, and they had a major role to play. So Jews now at Chautauqua feel that they have a home. That's a big step. Indeed.
Tell me what your responsibilities are and how a program is formed at the house.
Well, like most Jewish organizations, we have too many committees and a lot of arguments. Right. But there are a lot of people that are serve
Right.
in these capacities, and most of them are residents at Chautauqua, summer residents.
Right.
And a few, like Ken Fraden,
Right.
who you've talked with and have a very close association with yourself, was one of those people. So it's come together as a volunteer organization, basically, with a very strong desire to serve. We do a lot of programming. We have major speakers that come. We have a film series that we show, and so we often get very large crowds at the Everett House. 150 people for an event is not unusual.
Yeah. And I didn't even know if the space was designed for that many folks.
It wasn't originally. They, in the planning process, they decided to double the space of the community room to accommodate larger groups. And technologically, we've built the place so that we can transmit the lectures and the films from the community room down to the lower level where the library is, where we can put an additional 50 people, and then we have now equipped the porch area. It's a huge porch, the second largest porch at Chautauqua.
Yeah, I wonder if we could see that previous picture that we had that showed the porch. And let's talk about that for just a minute, and make trouble for our crew here. And there you can see the porch on the sides, and the next picture shows it from the angle. And he'll bring it up there. Take a look at that.
Yeah, it's an immense porch, and over on the to your left, as you look at the picture, there's a circular
knockout. Yeah.
Yeah. So we put our cameras over there, and in addition to all the people inside the building and up and downstairs, we have another 50 people or so that sit along the porch and can watch transmission of the image of the speaker or the film out on the porch as well.
Right. So that's a significant one. About how many people would come through the house for programs this summer, would you anticipate?
I think our average attendance is about 100 per event. And of course you're double counting some people.
Right.
But we're talking about through the door about 400 a week, plus visitors that come in that we show the house to.
Indeed.
So about 500 a week, and that's 9 weeks. That's over 4,000 that come through.
And it's a broad group of folks that come in. I think I've said this in one of the interviews already, but I can't help but repeating it. And that is we have some good close friends who wife and I brought here to Chautauqua. Both of them went to Catholic colleges in New York State, conservative Catholics, but they come back to Chautauqua, and every week they have to go to the Everett Jewish Life Center and go to a program, and they tell me that's part of the agenda, and they say this is something they would only get at Chautauqua. And normally I am berated for not joining them. I'm doing something else, but that's sort of the Chautauqua way. We're out of time, but I got one last question that I just hope you can answer, and that is if you could just take from a broad brush from your background as an historian, what influences has the Everett Jewish Life Center had on Chautauqua Institution?
They have advanced the cause of Jewish identity, not only at Chautauqua, but I think, believe it or not, nationally. We've had a lot of speakers from all over the country who have returned to their communities and have tended to share that Chautauqua spirit. That interfaith spirit is an important driving force at Chautauqua. And our guests reflect that, and it does have an impact on the communities that they return to. As a matter of fact, if you should look at the front door of the Everett Jewish Life Center, it was designed by a Pakistani Muslim and landscape architect.
Goodness.
Who is responsible for that door.
I didn't know
proud of that.
And I've got to take a look at it. And that's a great place to end this interview. This has been immensely good fun, Jerry, and I hope you'll come back and join us again on Chautauqua People.
I would love to. Thank you.
Thank you.